Welcome and thank you for joining us today for How to Preempt a Data Breach, New Techniques and Tools for Early Behavior Detection, Containment, and Response. My name is Raleigh Gould and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Our featured speakers are David Monahan, Research Director, Risk and Security Management at Enterprise Management Associates, and Ivan Shefrin, VP of Security Solutions at TaaSera. David, in-depth security experience, which spans over 20 years, has included organizing and managing physical and information security programs, including security network operations for organizations ranging from Fortune 100 companies to local government. Ivan has over 25 years of experience in network, systems, and security management. He was a co-founder and president of Network Performance Systems, where he led the company to an industry leadership position by capturing 50% of the market for IBM network routing design software. And before I hand things over to today's featured speakers, I did want today's audience to know that David and Ivan will be taking your questions at the conclusion of today's presentation, but do feel free to log those at any time throughout the course of the presentation by using the Q&A functionality. Also, today's event is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email from Enterprise Management Associates tomorrow that will include the on-demand playback as well as some additional resources, so be on the lookout for that email. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our first featured speaker, David Monahan. David?
Thanks, Raleigh. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you get a lot out of today's presentation and talking about how we can detect breaches and the tools and techniques that are available to do so. So let's kick it off initially, and I think a little background is appropriate here in that the threatscape is definitely expanding. Over time, we've seen a change in attacks, we've seen a change in attack methodologies, targets, and et cetera. So the mentality has changed from early hacking days where it was just about getting your name on the label of the Doritos box or getting your face up on a website or putting something up like that. And it's not as much nuisance motivated as it is financially motivated now. We're seeing that from all directions we're getting attacks against our infrastructure, against our corporate sites, against our government sites, etc. And ultimately, they're not so much interested in making some kind of socio-political statement as they are about actually gaining information. And it also doesn't matter if you're in the healthcare industry versus one of the others we've already mentioned. And we've seen breaches in each one of these segments over the last 12 to 14 months. So I think we should all be fairly well briefed on the types of attacks we're seeing just in terms of data capture, whether it's PII, personal identifying information, whether it's health information, government information, etc. So ultimately, since we know that money is power, if we think about this logical chain, we know that knowledge is power, and you can trade knowledge for money. So ultimately, we can see the chain of events here, and this is why things are changing. Unfortunately, most of the criminal underground is monetarily motivated, and so they're doing that. And there is no information specifically that is exempt from these types of attacks. It really doesn't matter. One of the things that we're seeing in terms of compromise is the huge growth in the number of security incidents. You can see here in the chart, we compare to things that are talked about in the marketplace as, the expansion of mobile phones is tremendous. Well, there's roughly a 22% increase in global users of smartphones, but you can see there's a 48% increase in the number of global security incidents, so more than twice. So when we think about the security incidents in context with other things, it really is dwarfing a lot of activities that we hear a lot of hype about. An interesting quote here that I wanted to share with you from PwC, which is where this particular chart came from, it indicates that no matter what area you're in, no matter what you're doing, you need to assume that you are compromised. And ultimately, we are seeing a change in mentality from those who haven't been compromised to those who have been compromised, and those who have been compromised to those who know they've been compromised and those who don't. And I don't think it's so much trying to be a pessimistic worldview. It's really more so trying to determine, change the mentality so we can be more proactive in how we are actually beginning to look for infiltration, look for attacks, and look for data exfiltration. some of the things that we've seen in terms of research, EMA has done a lot of research, and I've got a number of key items here. I've got one from Ponemon as well, but I think these are all key issues and concerns around the change in the mentality and the change in the environment, the internet scape, if you will. So the first one I wanted to speak to was that 78% of organizations feel that they're inconsistent in their ability to correlate security data to business impact. This is huge because this is what drives budgeting for a lot of security organizations. They're looked at as insurance policies, if you will, and so they're given money based on the things that they detect and or the things that they stop. But ultimately, if the security organizations are unable to identify and correlate how the security incidents affect the business and what types of monetary loss or reputational loss or things like that could be incurred by these issues, they're not going to be successful in getting that budget. Additionally, we can also see that confidence is pretty low. Ultimately, we have this situation where organizations are somewhat confident to highly doubtful that they could detect an issue before it had a significant security impact. Now, that's 69%. Now, this was taken from a study that I did last year. I just completed a similar study this year, and that figure has risen from 69% to 79%. So we can see that from the year of the breach being 2014, organizations are even less confident that they have the ability to detect a security incident or issue before it creates a serious business impact. That's a crucial issue as well because that creates this fear, and it's not unjustified either from what we're seeing. Now, we don't want to go running around like it's a zombie apocalypse or something like that, obviously, but we do need to understand that there are things happening that we are not seeing, and ultimately, these companies like Home Depot and Target and these other unfortunate, Anthem and so forth that have been compromised, they thought they were seeing the big picture and then ultimately realized that they weren't. Somebody got in the back door. Another key statistic, organizations unable to see or stop exploits because of outdated or insufficient threat intelligence. I think this is a significant driver of the previous item. So 60% of these organizations say, we're just not getting enough information to be able to fight the problem, to detect the problem, and that's a key driver. 57% of organizations believe that they aren't able to deal with the situation, and they're going to need more information from InfoSec technology vendors. We say, hey, ultimately we don't have the tools that we need currently. We don't know if they exist, and so we need your help to be able to drive success in this area of detecting, prevention, response, and those types of things. I think this one's a key as well. 41% said they really can't tell what's going on in their environment to be able to distinguish legitimate activities from malicious activities. This is a key aspect in terms of separating not only malicious insiders from legitimate, people that are just doing their jobs, because that can be difficult, but also being able to separate the external threats who've gotten inside the organization and started to exfiltrate or at least collect data. Ultimately, if we think about the change in mentality of hacking, it used to be, again, they'd get in, they'd try and get root or administrator access on a box, they take care of business, they get out, and they've got their name somewhere, they've modified a website, etc. Now we're seeing that they want to come in, they're going to compromise a legitimate user, and then they're going to use that legitimate user's identity to be able to extract information from the corporation or the organization over time. And so they'll sit in that environment and be able to extract information for a considerable period of time. Ultimately, that causes a difficulty from the security and administration's perspective because the user that's doing this looks to be a normal user, and they're not doing anything that looks overtly different than what the user does. Now, ultimately, it does take a better set of tooling. We're going to talk about the capabilities here of doing this to be able to separate something that's slightly different than what that user normally does from what they normally do, and I think that's a key aspect of being able to differentiate these and distinguish legitimate from malicious activities. We can see that 38% said they had frustration with IT security technologies. They don't have the ability to integrate their solutions. We've seen a migration from the solution suite players, the large companies that we'll do everything for you. We have a solution for X, Y, and Z, to more of a best in breed or point player And I think that part of the issue we're going to feel here is the ability to integrate those. So this information here was taken early last year. We've seen this migration, and I'm actually gathering information about this particular thing right now, and I'm seeing that those best-in-breed companies have seen it as an imperative to create integrations with their own technology and other technologies that they can either feed information to or extract information from in order to gain higher fidelity information and context. Lastly, frustration with IT security technology with the inability to recognize new and emerging threats and attacks. So 36% said that, and I think that number has actually begun to increase over the last year as well. I don't have the final numbers for that in my current research study. I wish I had for the webinar, so I apologize for that. But I can absolutely say that we see changes in attacks, we see changes in the methodologies, and so as these, whether it's malware, web drive-bys, social engineering, phishing, etc., as these attacks begin to move and migrate, the technology has to be able to keep up with them, and that can be a significant issue. As we look at the threats, right, they are persistent, and it's not just a catchphrase, a persistent threat. We can see that organizations, criminal organizations specifically, as well as nation states, are driving harder to get the information. Whether they have to call you, whether they have to send you a phishing email, or get a duplicate site, whatever the case may be, they're continuously trying. And as we are deluged with these different types of attacks, we ultimately are going to succumb as human beings. Someone's going to be able to trick us. We can't be 100% vigilant. And I've given some examples here of various types of attacks we've seen over the last year or so. We have Zeus, which then migrated into Game Over, and many other variants there, which tries to identify which tries to create botnets and steal data. We have the Crypto Locker or Crypto Wall malware, which was ultimately for ransomware, to steal data access, not the data itself, but just to capture the access and then extract ransom from kind of extortion. We've also seen, of course, many types of point-of-sale terminal malware that have moved throughout various networks, being able to compromise millions upon millions of the PII and personal identifying information and credit card information. So these have been terrible. Now, despite all of these new, and I'll put this in air quotes, cool attacks, the nation states have also gotten out there and begun to play rough and hardball, if you will. And we've seen things like Stuxnet over the last couple of years. We've seen things like direct memory access to video RAM malware. We've seen the Tailored Access Operations, or TAO group, from the NSA creating microprocessor embedded malware to gather information from their targets. We've seen most recently, I think about a month ago, this new NLS 933W DLL, which was discovered to be embedded in the firmware of multiple major hard drive distributors. So whether it's Western Digital, Hitachi, whomever makes them, and these were pretty scary because all of these are not or were not detectable by organizational malware detectors and antivirus and so forth at the time they were produced. And some of them aren't detectable because they just don't exist in the spaces they scan. If you're talking about microprocessor embedded malware, or hard drive firmware embedded malware, or even the DMA stuff, none of this is where a traditional malware vendor is going to look when they scan your hard drive for malware. So ultimately, all of these 0 days were created, and many of them can still exist because they're just not capable of seeing them with traditional defenses. And the sad part about this is, as we've actually seen instances where, for example, Stuxnet was reverse engineered, and there's been criminal organizations that are now using that. So unfortunately, these nation states, in their cutting-edge technology, using this to extract whatever type of information they're trying to get to, whether it's manufacturing information, defense information, so forth, they're teaching the criminal organizations what they can do to extract monetary information as well. So this is a really nasty evolution and kind of one-upmanship game. Going to that, the question comes to kind of a rhetorical question, but are we actually having better defenses driving more advanced attacks, or are we having more advanced attacks driving better defenses? And I think ultimately the sad part of it is really more of the latter. The advanced attacks jump in, they come out with something crazy and new, and then the defense organizations have to create a new defense or create a new methodology for defending against that, just because of the way these attacks are evolving and the methodology in which they're trying to defend. So this creates a significant problem for us. What I wanted to demonstrate here was the evolution of these defense technologies. So we're talking about this one-upmanship between the attackers and defenders, and we can see from beginning of the 1990s, we had various types of internet protections, and whether we're talking about IDSs or packet firewalls or stateful inspection, etc. We began to create these perimeter defenses initially, and then we added network defenses, and then we added some system defenses, and each time we're trying to I guess drop back from that line of defense, going, okay, perimeter's not doing so well, so let's watch the network. Network's not doing so well, so let's watch the endpoint. And each time we had to regroup. And then we saw in the 2000s we got, let's beef up the network and let's beef up the perimeter and let's beef up the endpoint. So we tried the same thing again. We got better firewalls. We got better detection for intrusion detection and prevention. We got better at looking at the endpoints in terms of maybe whether it's application whitelisting or blacklisting, user activity monitoring, sandboxing, all these things that are going on. And ultimately, as these attacks continue to evolve, we continue to see the same types of problems. We drop back, we begin to fail, we drop back, and then in 2010 we said, okay, well, what else can we do to continue this defense? And we started having better threat analysis, better user behavioral analysis as opposed to just activity monitoring. What is the user doing that looks odd? And memory analysis in terms of the systems and trying to identify processes and things that are running on that system that may be a problem. They indicate compromise of some kind. And these defenses directly evolved in consideration with some of these items that we saw a couple of slides ago in terms of the frustration with IT technologies, inability to recognize threats, or the distinguishing legitimate from malicious activity. So each one of these dropbacks, if you will, or adjustments, we're adjusting to some kind of new threat in the environment, and we've just continued to repeat that process. And now we're in the, if you will, the late 2010s, 2015s, whatever you want to call it, and we're trying to find new and better solutions. And specifically, we'll talk about some of those in just a moment as well. But why did these technologies that we've had as mainstays in our environments, why are they falling short? So I want to talk a little bit about that. And ultimately, we're in the age of big data, if you will, but I don't think it's so much about having big data as it is having better data. Now, absolutely, there are tools for all sorts of things. I want to talk about some genres here that I think are important. But ultimately, each one of these technologies, when you look at it as an individual tool, has some significant shortcomings because of the way it's designed or the type of data that it uses. So, for example, SIM and general data analytics. Oftentimes these can't handle unstructured data. They also are highly dependent upon other data sources. SIM does not generate its own data. It's going to get logs from wherever you can feed it. Data analytics, it's wholly reliant upon getting information into its banks to be able to analyze the patterns and so forth. So from these perspectives, if you don't have complete data, if you have gaps in your coverage, whatever the case may be, you're ultimately going to have a problem in having full visibility. The other issue that we have here is not only the incomplete data, but the fact that we have so many pieces of data that can be poured into these things. If we're trying to create rules or policies to gain efficacy out of these systems, we're going to have difficulty deciphering all the information and breaking it down. And ultimately, as we analyze and correlate these things, we have a problem because we don't know what we don't know. If we're reliant specifically upon creating policies and rules to identify these issues in our networks, as a new threat evolves, we're unaware of it, and so we're unable to create a policy. So it's essentially a zero day that's going to keep causing problems in our environment until the point that we have identified it or somebody else has, and we go, oh, let's create a rule to do this. With network packet analysis, you can gather a huge amount of information, absolutely not an issue from that perspective. The issues you have are, one, coverage. Where are you placing the packet analyzers? Are you able to put them all over your network so you can see lateral spread and lateral movement of issues, or are you just putting them at the gateway so you're only seeing it at the point at which it's trying to go out the door and you've basically been owned? Another issue we have is we can't see changes on the host. Yes, we may see a command and control packet go through. We may see a command of some kind, but ultimately we don't know what the software on the endpoint, the malware, has done and what changes it's made. So often the response to that is, well, just isolate the system, unplug it from the network, re-image it, and start over. Huge amount of manpower there that goes into that. Additionally, network packet analysis can be blinded by a number of tricks, whether that's protocol tunneling, whether that's encryption, and things like that. So ultimately, if your packet analyzer doesn't have the capability to see into the packets, it knows something went by, but it can't tell you what has happened. So that creates some blind spots as well. Additionally, when we look at endpoint control, so endpoint control can tell us obviously what happens on the end of the host, but it does have its gaps. And I just want to put this off to the side initially. Antivirus, it doesn't do the job. We should all be realizing at this point, yes, it's great for nuisance malware, but it's not going to get us where we need to be. So I just kind of put that as here as antivirus is dead. It's been a statement that was put out in the market last year, and so let's just move on. One of the biggest concerns and issues we see with endpoint control is the agent deployment and maintenance. We end up with devices that aren't responding properly because they haven't been deployed properly, or we just didn't see them, didn't get them out, whatever. So you do have blind spots that result from a strict endpoint reliance. Additionally, the other aspect that we have is this whole issue with visiting devices or roaming devices, BYOD, etc. Oftentimes, in many devices, these devices are not managed, and so they're not covered by endpoint control. We don't know what's going on those things. We aren't understanding if they are already compromised, if they're exfiltrating data, and so now our smartphone becomes a data exfiltration gateway, putting stuff out on, if not the Wi-Fi, the cellular networks we have no visibility into at all. Additionally, endpoint control can be broadly configured to try and accommodate for business requirements, which leaves gaps, or it may also not be able to see hidden processes and things like that. If the endpoint control itself is compromised by some sort of malware, rootkit, etc., then it's going to be worthless in terms of security because it can't be trusted. When we look at malware detection and analysis, those things can be fooled as well, especially when we talk about sandboxes. Now, all sandboxes are not created equal, so I have to speak generally here, but ultimately the issues we have with that is malware can be trained to look for sandbox environments and identify them and not execute. They also have the issue with polymorphism, where these particular pieces of malware can change, and so the sandbox doesn't understand what's going on there, and the authors of that malware have created it such that as it detects these sandboxes, it detects certain aspects, believes that the clock isn't working properly, etc., it will be able to modify itself on the fly and not execute. We also have just a simple issue of delay execution. So if the sandbox is set to emulate a certain time frame, you just have to outwait it. And yeah, you may wait a little longer to get kicked off, but if we understand that hackers are sitting in our network for an average of 8 months before they're discovered, I believe what's a month in that particular time frame to wait for success. The last issue, which is kind of interesting and more evolving, is the aspect around human interaction. So the malware is programmed to watch for mouse clicks and mouse movement, keyboard, non-patternistic behavior that's very difficult to emulate in a sandbox environment. So it can then hide because it says, I don't think you're a real user. I think you're a machine, so I'm going to hang out and wait. Now, we've seen a lot and heard a lot about big data, and absolutely big data can provide us a lot of good information. But when we look at, again, informational gaps, if there are gaps there, you don't have it in your data engine, so it's not going to be able to evaluate. You're going to have gaps in that analysis. One of the other issues we run into significantly for security is most big data engines are batch-driven. They're not real-time. And so ultimately, by the time you get your batch information back, that malware or that malicious actor has had time to do something, and whether that's spread or exfiltrate data, etc., that creates a significant issue for us. So we really don't want to get caught in the situation where we have the analysis capability, but we have to wait for hours or days to be able to do it. We also have the issue potentially with the solutions that are created. The engines and the analysts are not focused on security. They're focused on business process and so forth, normally business problems. And so they may have gaps in their ability to detect certain types of anomalies. And that's very reliant upon the type of technology that you've purchased or are going to purchase for your big data analysis and your business analysis. So even though these tools can be good, you have to be aware of some of their limitations. And I think really that batch implementation is really the biggest issue from a security perspective. Ultimately, when we look at malware, and the issue is that the threat actors and malwares are like Boy Scouts, right? They want to leave no trace. So even if you have a big data analysis or some other kind of data analysis tool, if the malware is not leaving log evidence or other types of behavioral evidence that you can easily detect, or detect within a patternistic perspective, then you're not going to be able to see that. And ultimately, the tools are only as good as their data for being able to deliver results. One of the key aspects of the big data issue came from Monahan's study, which said if you can receive actionable intelligence within 60 seconds of a breach, you can reduce the cost of responding to that breach and recovery by an average of 40%, and that's huge. In the study that Monahan did there, it was multi-millions of dollars that the organizations that participated were able to save by getting this information quickly. So if you're again waiting for hours or days to get your information, you've already lost the cost of solutions that may end up helping you to be better. I think one of the key aspects of defending against attacks is the ability to identify the threats or the attacks by their DNA. And that's not just a catchphrase, if you will. Ultimately, if we think about the way that researchers use DNA to identify genetic markers to looking for cancer and other illnesses, they're able to do early detection and then let the individuals who are affected by that know much earlier, significantly raising their chances for recovery. The same thing is true with a threat. If we can identify the building blocks, the attributes, the patterns, and the methodologies whereby these attacks are taking place, we can identify them earlier and get to that 60-second or maybe less time frame, and then be able to thwart that attack in a much better manner. And I think that's absolutely a key for multiple factors, whether it's cost, whether it's business impact, individual user impact, et cetera. These are all absolutely key aspects of being able to identify the underlying attributes of attacks. So, ultimately, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to get visibility to what's happening. We have issues with old data in terms of getting information about the times and places and identities. We have issues around data moving over non-standard ports. We're looking for things like machine-to-machine communication. Each of these things are aspects of intelligence that we can leverage to determine if something is an attack, if it's a malicious user, whatever the case may be. Additionally, one of the very, very big aspects here is data moving between trust zones. So if we see our point-of-sale terminals trying to connect to other devices or trying to connect out on the Internet, that should be a huge red flag as soon as that type of an activity begins to happen. If we see internal servers, not necessarily internal workstations, right? I may be by policy allowed to use Dropbox to move information to my salespeople or customers or whatever, great. But if you see internal servers and infrastructure devices trying to access Dropbox or some other kind of file sharing service, that's a really big one as well. If the data transfer patterns change, either in volumes, times, and so forth, that's another big one that's very, very key for trying to identify what's going on in the environment. Why do we have a data file that's now moving at midnight when we've never seen that before? That's something we should jump on very quickly. Ultimately, we want to also eliminate false positives. So after we get visibility and we're collecting this information to be able to see what's going on in the environment, we're going to have anomalous results or things that happen that we're not really sure. And that's how this picture relates here. If you've ever seen this before, the question is, do you see the old woman or do you see the young woman? And which one is the false positive? Right? So ultimately, one is meant to mislead us. The other is actually the thing that's going on. And so we want to be able to get visibility, but we want to be able to laser in and determine which picture we're supposed to be looking at so that we can ultimately respond appropriately and use our resources as best as possible. And since the attackers are trying to hide, they're going to try and make themselves look like something that's in your environment. And so let's say that the young woman here is the attacker. She's going to try and look like the old woman who's just going about her business and isn't trying to raise a problem. When we look at the techniques, what are some of the new techniques and aspects that have come into being that are helping us to be able to do this? Well, one, we have machine learning, and we also have combined with that community and behavioral analysis. So machine learning is a little different because it's not like statistical analysis where you get a piece of data and you're looking at the way the data shapes and moves and forms. Machine learning actually takes that data and then begins to learn about how that data is coming in, how it's perceived, how it's processed, and modifies the algorithm over time such that it can hone in on things that look different. Community and behavioral analysis are also similar in that behavior analysis says we looked at an individual and we see what they normally do, and given themselves, they normally access these types of files, they do these types of behaviors, and now suddenly they're accessing more data, they're accessing different data, different file shares. And so why is that the case? That's a significant indicator that something has changed, and either that individual has become an insider threat and malicious, or that individual's identity has become compromised. Another advanced capability that we have is community analysis. And that one's been very, very useful because we determine that individuals and groups tend to act similarly. It's kind of like the old Sesame Street, like one of these kids is doing his own thing. And so if you have three people in this organization that are doing similar things and one person that's doing something totally different, then now we have an issue. Why is that person very different? Do we have someone that's over permissioned or under permission? Are they in the wrong group? Or are they truly in the right place, but they're doing the wrong thing? And each one of these types of analysis are very, very adaptive, and that's very cool. Real-time pattern analysis, we come back to that DNA analysis idea where the way an attack is performed, the way that software, aka malware in this case, behaves, the way that an individual behaves, indicate its underlying intent, its underlying DNA and structure. And if we can identify that and break it down to its component parts, we can then see other attacks that use similar patterns, whether it's the similar malware or different malware, but executes along the same patterns. These are key, and it's not just trying to log in somewhere or something trivial like that. It can actually be very, very sophisticated in terms of the ways that the software behaves internally, the way that it tries to communicate, the way it tries to move, etc. We also have contextual risk prioritization and threat modeling. So we've had risk analysis for years. We've had threat modeling to some degree for years as well. But the idea is being able to gather the correct information, analyze it with the other techniques, and then create a laser-focused context around a situation so that we can better prioritize it and better identify the threat within that particular risk. So ultimately, when you can drive these activities down to that laser type of focus, you eliminate those false positives. You're able to move forward. You also have crowdsourcing and community sourcing, and these are a little different. So these are more focused on what am I seeing in my environment, what are you seeing in your environment. Let's pool that information to determine if we see commonalities and then be able to use that across the whole. So if I see it first, can I share that with you in some fashion so that you can say, hey, if you see this is bad, right? This showed up in my environment. So these tend to accelerate the scope of knowledge, and they produce a very much faster methodology for being able to get down to the core issues. And we're seeing that in a kind of a rudimentary fashion, if you will, from your traditional antivirus vendors or something like that, right? Symantec and these guys say, hey, we have tens of millions of hosts out there, so we see something faster so that we can get signatures out and so forth. Well, that's the foundational aspect. But then beyond that, we have better tools to identify the advanced threats and these persistent threats, and then we can get that information out, which is something your traditional antivirus isn't going to see. We want to correlate internal and external indicators of risk and compromise. So that goes sort of along with the crowdsourcing model in that there's information within our networks that indicates something has happened. There's also information out there that indicates that a particular IP address or domain are bad, right? They tend to do things that are questionable, risky, or flat out just bad and malicious. And so we want to be able to combine the information about those types of external activities with the information that we have to be able to, create a better contextual risk prioritization and understand the threats behind those so that we can keep from being compromised. Additionally, we have some holistic integrations, and we talked about the fact that vendors or that customers are saying, hey, we don't get enough integration. So what are some of the things that we can do to fix that? Well, one is within our own software, within our own solutions, we want automated response. And I want to differentiate automated between automatic. Automatic is something people are very, very scared of. They don't want it because they don't want a machine trying to determine what should be blocked, stopped, etc., isolated. We have that's kind of a vestige appendage, if you will, from the early and from mid-90s, where we had our integrations with firewalls and IDSs, and then, hey, we can get the IDS to tell the firewall to block this connection, and then attackers learn, well, hey, if I send spoofed IP addresses, then I can get them to block an IP address which is actually good, and I can cause an internal denial of service attack. So that people say, we don't want that. What we do want is the ability for individuals to be able to be given enough information and context to be able to make a go-no-go decision very, very quickly. So they can say, yes, I want you to block this host. Yes, I want you to reset this connection, something like that. And ultimately, if we can get to that level where we're presenting enough information where something reasonable can be determined very quickly, we can use individuals that have less skill to be able to fill the seats that we can't fill right now with the more skilled individuals. We also want to integrate existing infrastructure and control. So we don't want tools that are isolated. We want to make sure that if we've built all this cool information in our Active Directory LDAP infrastructure, or we're using some sort of privileged identity management or identity management solution, we can get that information and leverage that within our tools to identify faster who's doing what, why is this different, and then ultimately how are we going to respond. So these are very, very useful as well. We also want to use our other infrastructure. So whether it's firewalls, vulnerability scanners, endpoint protection. Previously we talked about limitations of various types of technologies. That doesn't mean they're invalid, right? We want to make sure that ultimately we use the information and the capabilities they have to increase their ROI as return on investment, as well as being able to increase our protection. So we need better technology to pull these various technologies together and produce a higher quality of result. Additionally, we also want these solutions to be cloud ready. We have a lot of data out there in the cloud, so we need solutions that can protect our cloud environment and as well as leverage the cloud environment for elasticity. So if we have a solution that's supposed to help us identify what's going on in our environment and the volume of data coming in increases significantly, do we have the ability to leverage that cloud elasticity in that solution to be able to process more data? Or also, additionally, do we have the ability to put a virtual machine of some kind out in the cloud to be able to protect that cloud environment specifically and see what's going on, rather than having to backhaul traffic or do some other kind of crazy routing technique that can ultimately raise complexity and potentially impact our ability. And I hope you've noticed on these side pictures that I'm doing that they're meant to go along with our threads. And that earlier you saw the mixed up picture where we have these missing data points and mixed up data points. And now ultimately with using these types of techniques, we're going to give ourselves a clear picture. So now I say, okay, I know that this is a fish. I know what's going on, and now I'm going to react appropriately. It's not a threat. It is a threat. Whereas before, I really wasn't sure if what I was seeing was a shark or a goldfish, right, or something like that. Was it a threat or was it not? So ultimately, I hope thus far that we've been able to show you some useful information about how we're trying to advance the techniques and tools. And I'd like to hand the time over now to Ivan to talk a little bit about TaaSera and their capabilities.
Thanks, David. Appreciate the introduction. So I want to just recall one thing you said about the number of systems already compromised. And in the last year or so, in about the 100 different organizations I've been in and taken a look at to help out, we've seen well over 90% of those already compromised, and in many cases closer to a major data breach than they already knew. So I've personally seen that confirmed out in the field. So today I'm going to give you a quick overview of a real-world example of how we were able to help one of our customers use preemptive breach detection to stop a major data breach from happening. And there were really there were six things that David highlighted earlier that I think are brought out by this example. One of them is the need of filling in the missing pieces of information that we often don't have, because otherwise many cases behaviors are simply hidden today due to data obfuscation, tunneling, protocol abuse and violations, lateral movement within an organization that are just very hard to find today. PDFs, executables masquerading inside PDFs and image files, and so on. And so this is really the key, one of the key calling cards of preemptive breach detection systems like TaaSera NetTrust. And then next is the ability to analyze those threat patterns in real time. So it's not just being able to observe the behaviors, but being able to piece them together into meaningful patterns that represent a multi-stage coordinated attack that is occurring both real time and over the last number of X days. And then being able to prioritize the risk this represents to my system. So as security analysts, we're all here, we don't exist just to look at events and examine data. We're really all here, and our jobs revolve around protecting assets and information. And so by prioritizing according to the risk of breach rather than whether an individual discrete piece of evidence represents a threat or not is important, and that's another thing that we'll talk about briefly today. And then being able to share that intelligence both within the global community of security users, but most importantly within your own organization, and being able to report up to management and across to peers on your security risk posture, and integrating and leveraging your existing ecosystem of tools, policies, and practices. So the particular example that I'm going to talk about today was, in fact, a game over Zeus variant, where we observed, working with this client, an ongoing backdoor exploit behavior followed by a series of file downloads, a peer-to-peer domain generation algorithm that made it very hard to pin down what the external interactions were, obfuscated callbacks that were very difficult to detect using normal techniques, and ultimately attempts at exfiltrating data by hiding inside in some cases it was network time protocols, NTM. So this particular client did have an established incident response process that was fairly typical of moving from the ability to detect, triage, contain, and respond to an event. Really, in many cases, the difference here was that they were able to do this in minutes instead of months. I think the average breach takes about 8 months to find today, and usually it's some third party like the FBI or a credit card company knocking on our doors. But being able to do this to preempt the breach rather than after the fact was a key differentiator to this customer's process. And they were able to detect the hidden behaviors that I just described around this game over Zeus bot, and identify the systems that were affected and prioritize them according to how much evidence they had actually collected, and then use that evidence to contain, block, disconnect those systems, and prevent it from spreading further, and then finally respond enterprise-wide to assess the damage, make sure it didn't happen again, and report to executive management using quantifiable metrics. So this is a screenshot of the data we were looking at from this particular customer. This is a heads-up dashboard showing monitored systems. So in this particular case, there were close to, I think, 5,000 systems in this enterprise. Without having to look at millions of events in one heads-up display, we were able to, on any given day, and in this particular instance, boil it down to 10 systems that were actively at risk of breach. And then we see a risk index here showing what the level is, a forensic confidence score telling us the depth and diversity of evidence, the threat classification and pattern analysis, which is represented in the next column, and then finally a means to look at the risk indicators for both contextual evidence and the actual behaviors themselves, as well as reporting. And what we were able to see in terms of this particular client is they noticed this pattern evolving very quickly from a low level to a high level of risk, investigated the data, and were able to immediately find 3 or 4 other systems within the environment, in this case 3 on this screen, that were exhibiting that exact same pattern of behavior. And that told them which systems they needed to contain and which systems were at the greatest risk. This is really, many of the enterprises I speak with, one of the greatest challenges is even when you find a inbound attack or you find an infected system, identifying what other systems may be also compromised is of great concern, because that creates a good deal of uncertainty as to whether you've actually cleaned it up and prevented it from spreading further. So in just a couple of clicks of a mouse, you're able to get that information here. And then we need to triage based on the risk of breach and the business impact, as David alluded to further. So To do this, we don't want to be looking at thousands of events and trying to figure out whether they're false positives, what systems they affect, and whether they're actually real. Instead, we want to understand what silos are these in. Is this a database server, or is it a printer, with a default community string or some obscure event like that? So we need to prioritize it based on what the type of data is stored on these systems, and what they are used for, and what evidence we have collected that they are at risk of breach. And that's going back to that risk index and forensic confidence score that we mentioned earlier, and then what contextual evidence we have. How can we look at the other evidence from across my entire security ecosystem to improve the fidelity of that data and provide us context? And that's what the TaaSera system here did in this particular case. So next stage, we'll look at containment. In this particular instance here, the data we saw was several inbound attacks, which were obfuscated shellcode exploits, followed by an egg download, outbound propagation as it searched for other systems, an attack preparation phase, followed by an egg download of the actual payload, and then finally command and control callback activity. The important point here is that these are all behavior-based. These were not signatures, and in many cases, a number of stages of these behaviors were completely hidden and obfuscated inside otherwise seemingly benign protocols and activities. And then the customer was able to actually drill down to the packet trace, because if you're going to intervene in a system and actually make some kind of change to your environment, you want to know damn well that, pardon my language, but you really need to know that this is indeed a problem. And so you can actually, by drilling down to the packet evidence, see not just the behaviors, but the events themselves in front of you, and essentially create what amounts to an incontrovertible warrant for intervention with that system. And of course, then communicating that across your organization is important. So there's a key information sharing intelligence aspect here that David alluded to, where identifying patterns on a single system or on one system is useful, but you need to understand not only which other systems are affected within your environment, but also across your enterprise and other departments that you may not control directly. And you need to be able to share those patterns within the global community so that that provides additional risk attribution. So if we observe an exploit behavior, for example, which is one of the categories in that fancy bar chart on the right, and we've matched that against known vulnerabilities or unpatched systems on the environment. And then lastly, we've also seen that same behavioral pattern across 500 users in the global community of TaaSera customers. Then those three pieces of evidence amount to really drive the risk of breach much higher for that system, and highlighted as something that needs to be prioritized and paid attention to more quickly. And so that's the process by which TaaSera can do that, and then also allow for community-based intelligence where you can submit your own pattern with a click of the mouse, and then see how many other systems that compares to. And then finally, for this particular client, and for most that I've had interaction with, it's very important to be able to report this both to executive management and your peers inside the enterprise. So many of us know, if you're in charge, responsible for security as an analyst, it's usually a different group who has responsibility for the network or the VM infrastructure or the application servers, both enterprise-wide and within individual departments. And so you need to be able to communicate this evidence very cleanly and effectively to all levels. So in this particular use case, the client had to go in front of the board of directors and they had taken a couple of systems down and disconnected a certain type of access to the network from the outside that was used by a sales force, and so there was actually a significant business impact and revenue impact to their business operations. And so the executive team and board of directors was very interested in restoring service as quickly as possible and making sure that they could minimize that impact. And they were able to use the reports here to really provide a hard metric, a quantifiable metric of our overall security risk posture. So instead of going in front of management with thumbs up and a smile when they ask you how are we doing on cybersecurity, we've now got some hard metrics that we can take in front of them, and then system by system provide that evidence, attach it to a ticket, and again, that warrant for intervention was very useful in solving this quickly. Finally, the contextual evidence that I mentioned earlier, it's critical to leverage existing investments that have been made. So it's doing that in the context of better, not big data. So if you've got behavioral evidence that a system is at risk or that a data silo is at risk, it's then that you want to pull in the relevant information from other sources like vulnerability patch and compliance tools, like Active Directory or log data that can be used to corroborate, and then it's much easier to make sense of that data, and you're doing joins on dependent instead of independent variables. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. We have a few minutes left for questions here, both for David and myself. You can log them in the Q&A panel. TaaSera will be at RSA at booth 4313 if you want to see a live demo, or you can visit our website to request one and inquire about a free trial as well. And so I thank you for your time and attention and look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you, Ivan. Great, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and start with you, Ivan. When you talked about TaaSera generating profiles of malicious activity, why is this any different than big data analytic tools detecting patterns of malicious activity?
Well, first of all, that's a great question. Thank you. So one of the most critical differentiators there is what data are you starting with? So first of all, malware doesn't usually, or at least well-written malware, doesn't leave a trail of log evidence. So if your big data is reviewing log data or even traditional IDS alerts or whatever the data sources are, 9 times out of 10, those behaviors just won't be available, because if the data is not available to big data, then it doesn't matter really how good your analysis is. So you have to start with the right data.
Excellent, thank you. David, let's jump over to you. One of the questions received from the audience is there a significant difference in attack type between individual or SOHO computers being attacked versus corporate PCs?
So I think the base answer is no. However, the slightly longer answer is it really depends more upon the vertical that you're in than it does whether you're at a specific location or size of location or home or whatever. Attackers aren't really looking so much at whether they think you'll be attaching from a home PC versus a work PC, though they obviously prefer the work PC for various types of data. What they are looking for in a lot of the persistent threats is what vertical you work in terms of banking or healthcare or whatever it is, manufacturing, etc., so that they can target that malware specifically for those types of environments to gather information about those environments and or specifically about the type of data that they have. And so we've seen that various types of malware is more effective in different types of environments based on the way people operate and the types of systems that exist in those environments, but not so much my home PC or SOHO PC versus my work PC.
And
go ahead, Ivan.
I was just going to add one piece of additional context there is we've seen a number of attacks, particularly in financial theft and in the ransomware, that actually started with a home computer, either was an exploit or a drive-by, something along those lines, but then was able to transfer over to the enterprise. In particular, there was a case fairly recently where we saw a medium-sized company lose tens of thousands of dollars on their payroll system because of such an attack at targeting a specific employee who was an administrator's home computer, and then using that to leverage themselves inside the enterprise as a whole. So I think they're kind of holistically joined, and it's really part of the puzzle. It's not something separate from my point of view.
Yeah.
Thank you both for that clarification. Let's take one more question. And David and Ivan, why don't you both chime in on your thoughts on this final question? During the presentations, you mentioned attack DNA. What is that really?
Do you want me to start, Ivan, or do you want to take a shot at it first?
I'll let you go first. I'm happy to either way. Sorry.
Okay, so I think the attack DNA, I hit on this a little bit, but I'll bring it back and kind of dive in a little more. The attack DNA really is all of the micro components that go into ultimately starting that attack and moving from the perimeter all the way through to a successful breach. And it's part of how the software behaves. It's part of how the software is constructed, if it's malware. It's also how it moves laterally. What does it do? How does it try to connect? How does it try to hide its exfiltration? How does it try to hide its lateral movement? So all of these various things are something that the attacker has to think about and then try to compensate for to be able to come in under whatever radars you're using in your environment. So from my perspective, it's a lot of little bits that go together to ultimately identify whether not only have we seen this malware before, but have we seen this type of attack before? Have we seen this pattern of movement, this pattern of behavior before? Ivan, you want to add to that?
Sure. In the work that was done very early in the development of TaaSera as a company, work done using government funding at SRI International with some research dollars, it was discovered that all malware, no matter what variant it is or what signature it has or how it gets through, exhibits, originally there was an 8-stage life cycle, but now expanded to a dozen or more discrete stages in what we call an infection life cycle. And so what we do is we map often hidden behaviors that wouldn't otherwise be able to be seen. So that's the first variant. But we map those to a pattern or sequence of activities along those infection life cycles. And then we look for the sequence, timing, and periodicity among those events to create effectively a DNA pattern that we can match across tens, thousands, hundreds of thousands of systems in real time. And that's kind of our definition of threat DNA, if you will.
No, I think that works well because ultimately, as we think about DNA, you can't change your DNA. And once these things are released into the wild, they're going to behave a certain way. And even if they're modified to create some sort of variant or branch, if you will, and when you look at those required things that have to happen to be successful, then if you can identify those types of things, you're going to be far more successful than looking for a specific signature or something like that.
Exactly. Raleigh, go ahead.
I was just going to thank you both for taking those questions. That does bring us to just about the top of the hour, so I also wanted to thank our audience for joining us today. As I mentioned at the beginning of the event, you will be receiving a follow-up email from Enterprise Management Associates tomorrow. That will include the on-demand playback and some additional resources, so feel free to check that out. We hope you do. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.